Not to say we don't want to write about Latin America, but we want to write about any subject we want. Why not? What is so difficult for a Latin American writer to write a novel about other countries, about other times, and without any magic? I like a lot magical realism of the first generation. I'm a real fan of Garcia Marquez's work, but it's impossible to only imitate once again the same formula. So, but right now, I think that in Latin America and in Spain, I'm not quite sure if that is happening in other countries, but in Latin America and Spain, and now is really normal to write about anything. So it's not only a crack success. There are many writers in many countries of my generation and younger that contribute to this changement of the impression of what a Latin American writer has to write. At the same time of the crack group, there was another group in Chile that wrote an anthology, Alberto Fuguet, called Macondo. Not Macondo as in 100 Years of Solitude, but Macondo as in McDonald's, in order to show how Latin America had changed and there were other ways to be Latin.
Were there any adjustments that had to be made in the translation when you were bringing all these different cultures into English, or did you trust the author's narrative voice when bringing all the different, like an American perspective on America versus a Mexican perspective on America? Were there any changes that needed to be made in the text?
Let me say that the kind of Spanish that Jorge uses in this novel is kind of neutral. Not absolutely, but every once in a while I found an echo even upon proof of it in his writing. But the fact is that there's a kind of neutrality, and so it's utterly translatable in that sense. I mean, I've come up against situations where someone, let's say, is using the slang of Mexico City in the 1960s. How would you translate that? You see, I mean, the problem with English, it's an advantage and it's a disadvantage in this way, is that it's very hard to do accents in written English. It's easy to do it in spoken English. You can imitate a Scotsman, an Irishman, or somebody from Liverpool, or somebody from Houston, Texas. But to get that on the page is impossible. And I used to try to kill myself, to imitate, create a slang that would be the equivalent. It always came out like Bugs Bunny. It didn't really work. But in his case, that was not an issue. The issue was clarity and making sure that the English was as clear as the Spanish was, to the degree that it could.
Yes, because the quality of these two books, of In Search of Klingsor and The End of Madness, is that the two narrators, the first one is a German and the second one is a Russian. So for me as a Mexican, I tried to construct a literary Spanish that it couldn't be very Mexican because it would be unbelievable to understand why a German or why a Russian could write with Mexican words. Of course, there is a Mexican Spanish because I never uses vosotros or I never uses some Spanish words. I use the normal Mexican words, but even with that, I tried to construct a more general kind of literary Spanish, only to be accurate with the personality of the narrator. When In Search of Klingsor was published, some Mexican Spanish critics didn't understand why I wanted to renounce to my particularities of my Mexican Spanish. But it's only because I wanted not to be an unbelievable narrator and to try to make credible a Russian or a German narrator. Even, for example, for this novel, when I started the project, I started learning Russian in order to understand more or less the grammatics of Russian. But I don't think that this is evident in the novel. I think it's only a way to be in touch with the culture of one of the main characters of the book, as I try to do that with the Americans that I watch more than the Russian part of the novel. But it's only a metaphor of writing.
Can you tell us about sort of the biggest puzzle you have encountered while translating The Season of Ash? Sort of,
Biggest puzzle?
yeah, if you had some
Get
sort
to the
of
last page. Each book is a specific set of problems. Each writer has a specific specifically idiosyncratic point of view, and sometimes they change. I just did an anthology of Jorge Volpi's writings about Argentina, essays from the 1920s, basically to the 1950s. And there's a guy who's trying to write to sound like an Argentine in the 20s, which is why he renounced all those books and bought them up and burned them as soon as he had any cash in his pocket, because he thought it was completely ridiculous. He burned his own ideas, but that's another point. But again, there I am. Here's Borges, a god for me, let's say. But am I going to try to? What accent would I try to use in English to emulate that Argentine drawl that he's trying to get into, with phony spellings and trying to get an oral quality? That had to be sacrificed, and I don't think that Borges would have approved of my putting him in a southern vernacular, even assuming I could do such a thing.
Is there any, well, I was thinking that there has to be some kind of, did you come across any discrepancies between stereotypes, maybe that we might have had, American might have about Russians, and say a Mexican might have of a Russian? And were there any times where you felt like you needed to avoid those stereotypes so as to give the true feeling of the story?
You know, I didn't have that problem because of the personality of each of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
And what you mean is when I was dealing, let's say, with
Cold War
the
assumptions.
did they sound like the same person?
No, more like, is there a discrepancy between maybe what we might perceive a Russian and therefore assume in the story, and what a Mexican might think of a Russian and therefore perceive in the story, that you felt you may have read in the translation?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I didn't. Could be just me. Since I didn't find that. My idea of Russians is mostly people from Brighton Beach. I've never been to Russia, so I don't have any real experience in that stuff. And I don't talk to scientists, so. And vice versa.
Well, I think there was always some stereotypes about Russians and Americans and some people. But I think that also a writer has the opportunity to try to deal with these stereotypes.